Well, hello, Bridgeway. And hello to you, Bridgeway, Owings Mills, Reisterstown. We're glad you're able to join us, as well as those of you who are online. As Pastor Angel talked about, we are in the middle of a summer series. Matter of fact, we are right in the middle of it. There's been 3 weeks before me. There's going to be 3 weeks after me. And we're right in the middle of a series about the I am statements from the Gospel of John, where Jesus uses these 7 I am statements to describe who he is and to let us know the kind of person he is and the kind of role he wants to play. So each of these are very important for Christ followers to understand, well, what are the implications of these? These are not just, 7 nice little cute little statements to hang in your office or something or to memorize. What do they actually mean from his point of view? Now, last week, we talked about Jesus' statement called, I am the gate. And the idea of last week, I am the gate, is Jesus is inviting us into a different kind of life. And so he says, I am the gate, whoever comes through me shall be saved. And then he ends in verse 10 that we talked about last week, and I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. And we talked about last week what a full life from Jesus' point of view looks like. And that it might be a little bit different than it is from our point of view, and how do we engage in it? And we did a little exercise to do that. Well, the I am statement we're going to look at today is incredibly connected to the one we looked at last week. In fact, they're only separated by 3 verses. And so, but it's still important to understand the bigger context of the story before we even get into it. And we talked a little bit about this last week. I'm going to give you the cliff notes of the cliff notes from last week. That chapter 9 and chapter 10 are so interconnected to each other, and 9 has such a huge influence on what happens in 10. So in chapter 9, we have the story of Jesus healing a man who was born blind. And through this whole process of the religious leaders getting involved and interviewing this guy to find out what actually took place, and the more interviewing they did, the more irritated they became to the point where they just threw the evidence out. It was much easier for them just to kick him out, we would use the term excommunicate, than try and deal with the reality of a man born blind who can now see. How do you explain that if you're not going to follow Jesus? And so they threw him out. And this action of the religious leaders throwing him out totally changes what happens in the Gospel of John. Because in chapter 9, because we have a man born blind, all the language and the ideas that are used by the Apostle John is about sight and blindness. Physical sight and blindness, spiritual sight and blindness. But as soon as they throw this guy out, Jesus changes his language, changes the vocabulary, and he changes it from sight and blindness to shepherd and sheep. Now, what you don't know, and you will learn today, is what Jesus does in that transition is explosive to his audience. It's the relational equivalent of taking a hand grenade, pulling the pin, and rolling it into a room. Because what he does is explode this illustration of shepherd and sheep so that everybody knows exactly what's going on. Now, what we don't have that the audience that Jesus was talking to had was a religious and theological history that explained to them exactly what in the world Jesus is talking about. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at John chapter 10, but then we're going to dive into the background behind it and find out why what Jesus said is so explosive to his audience. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to go to John chapter 10. If you don't have your Bibles, they'll put the verses up on the screen. But if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn there. And just so you know now, you need to put like a bookmark or something there because we're going to be going back and forth through several passages, and I want you to keep being able to come back to chapter 10 as we go through. So John chapter 10, we're going to begin with verse 9. All right, John chapter 10, starting in verse 9. Jesus says, and we looked at this last week, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. And then notice this phrase, and I talked about this phrase last week, that we'll talk about it this week. He will come in and go out and what? Find pasture. Hang on to that. Verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And that's what we talked about last week. And then here's today's I am. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So he sees the wolf coming, and he does what? Abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf does what? Attacks the flock, and then what happens? Scatters it. Hang on to scatters, attacks, abandons. Verse 13, the man runs away because he's a hired hand and what? Cares nothing for the sheep. Hang on to it. Your hands are getting full, I understand. And then there's this amazing statement that Jesus makes. I am the good shepherd, again. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Now, this is a very different kind of knowledge than what we normally think of when we say, I know something. Most of the time in our culture and in our language, when we say, I know something, we're talking about information, that I know something. But when Jesus in this verse says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me, it's a totally different kind of know. The know here means to know something by experiencing it. So, for example, in the past, in the earlier days of Bridgeway, I used to do premarital counseling. I used to describe premarital counseling as trying to teach someone how to swim without throwing them into a pool. Because I'm giving them stuff to know. Now, the only reason I'm giving them stuff to know, so later on I can say, I told you so. Which is one of the few privileges and excitements pastors actually get in their job. So I love that. I used to love premarital counseling because I could hardly wait for them to come back so I could say, I told you so. Because what they get in premarital counseling is very different what they get after the honeymoon. They now have a totally different experience, and they are learning by experience, aren't they? You've been there if you've been married, you understand. In fact, you find out how stupid you actually are once you get married. Because you thought you knew, because again, used to get this all the time. I know what other couples are, this is before they get married. I know what other couples are like, but it's different with us. Really? You look like a human being to me. And human beings function the exact same way they always do. And they are never prepared for what marriage gives them. And then once they get that figured out, or sometimes before, then kids come along. And that's a whole nother learning experience. When Jesus says, I know my sheep, he is saying, I have experience with them in life. I know them because I do life with them. Now, that's easy for us to kind of comprehend, but the next statement is mind-blowing. Because he says, I know my sheep, and my sheep what? Know me. Exact same word. We know who Jesus is because of the life experience we have with him. Do you have any? Because see, for us who go to church, who grew up in church, the most dangerous thing we have is knowledge. Because that can fool us into thinking we actually know who God is. And we actually know who Jesus is. Because we can quote the verses better than anybody else. But do we really know him by experience? See? I remember one time, I've used this story before in the past, there was a girl in our church who was dating someone, and she thought this was the one, and the relationship just totally disintegrated one day. And she is in her living room, on her knees, based on her personality, angry as all can get out, and weeping all at the same time. And she says out loud in her living room, how can you let this happen to me? And she heard this as clear as she could hear anything else. get a pen. Now, that might not sound like the most spiritually deep communication you've ever gotten from Jesus. But one of the ways you know that that's him is because it's not you. And she went and got a pen and a piece of paper and just started writing, and very quickly revelation came that she had replaced the giver with the gift. And that once she had done that, her heart had been taken away. And God wanted her heart back. That's experience. I hope you've had them. I had one this week. Now, if you don't know this, because of your experience, God is annoying. You just try living with someone who knows everything, has been everywhere, and is all powerful. It's very annoying. Whenever you get into an argument with him, you're always going to lose. I'm sitting in my office, he taps me on the shoulder, and I go, "What?" I'm working on a message. For you, by the way. And he points to something inside me and goes, "What's that?" I'm like, "I'm working on a message for you." He's like, "Do you want a message from me or do you want a message from you?" I'm like, "Fine." So this week I had to call someone into my office and confess to them, and they did not even know this was going on, about how selfish I was being from the inside out. And the impact that that was having on how I was interacting with them. Is that good enough for you? Yes, we have a message to work on. That's how it works. He's annoying. And he puts his finger many times on stuff that's the inside that nobody else sees. But you need to pay attention. You can go tone deaf really fast. Again, if he keeps poking and you keep ignoring, that just calluses the poke. And you are in very dangerous territory when that happens. Because now you're saying, "I'm one of your sheep," but you're no longer listening. So my question is, do you know him? If he annoys you like he annoys me, you probably do. So we have this powerful passage that Jesus paints in John chapter 10. But there's so much more going on underneath the surface. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Ezekiel chapter 34. Ezekiel chapter 34. For some of you, you're going to have to unstick the pages. In the Old Testament, it's in the prophets. Ezekiel chapter 34. This is a foundational Old Testament prophet chapter about how God and Israel, his country, his nation, interact and what he thinks about what's going on. And every person in Israel at the time of Christ knew this passage and knew what it said and knew the vocabulary and knew the language. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. Let's start in verse 2. It starts off, "Son of man," and the son of man is Ezekiel, "prophesy against" what? The shepherds of who? Hang on to that language. "Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the" who? Now, when he says woe, that's not a Keanu Reeves like, whoa. Whenever you see woe in the Old Testament, that's bad. Bad news for whoever's name comes after that. The sovereign Lord says, "Woe to the shepherds of Israel," and then notice this, "who only take care of themselves." And then there's a question, should not shepherds take care of the flock? Now, keep your finger there in Ezekiel 34, go back to John chapter 10, and look at verse 13. And notice what Jesus says. "The man runs away because he's a hired hand, and" what? cares nothing for the sheep. Back to Ezekiel 34. Verse 4. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. Verse 5. So they were what? Scattered. Have you heard that before? Because there was what? No shepherd. And they were scattered and became food for all the what? Wild animals. Back to John chapter 10 again. Keep your finger in 34. Go back to 10:12. John chapter 10, verse 12. The hired hand is what? Not the shepherd. There's no shepherd. Because he does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he does what? Abandons the sheep and runs away, and the wolf attacks the flock and what? Scatters it. Back to Ezekiel 34. Drop down to verse 12. As a shepherd looks after his what? Scattered flock. When he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. Now, there's a huge transition change here in Ezekiel 34, because now God's going to say multiple times, I will, I will, I will, I will. This is what I'm going to do in response to what's going on out there. He says, I will rescue them from all the places they were, what? Scattered on the day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out into their own land. I will what? Pasture them on the mountains of Israel. Keep your finger in 34. Go back to John chapter 10, verse 9, the verse we looked at last week. Jesus says, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. And then here's our interesting little phrase. He, she will come in and go out and what? Find pasture. Back to Ezekiel 34, verse 14. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. Just another word for pasture. There they will what? Lie down. We'll come back to that. In a good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them do what? Lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. When Jesus in John chapter 10 starts using language like abandoned, scattered, doesn't care, attacks, find pasture, all those things, when he begins to use that kind of language and description, everybody in the room knew what he was talking about. They knew he was referencing Ezekiel 34. Now you have to, again, remember what sparked chapter 10. What sparked chapter 10 is them kicking the blind man out, excommunicating him. And as soon as they did that, Jesus changes the language from blindness and sight to shepherds and sheep. Why? Because the religious rulers in his day were a perfect example of Ezekiel 34. He's describing and telling them and everybody else that's there, oh, that's you. That's exactly what you just did. It's interesting, at the end of chapter 9, after they throw him out, Jesus goes and finds him. And they have this face-to-face encounter, because this guy's never seen him yet. He was born blind. And now Jesus goes and finds this sheep who's been thrown out and pulls him into him, because he is the what? Good shepherd. See? And so everybody, that's why I say it's like he took a grenade and rolled it in the room and said, this is who you are. Kaboom. But then he describes himself as what? The good shepherd. So we've got these. In fact, if you notice in the John passage, he actually never even calls them a shepherd. He calls them thieves and robbers and hired men. Never calls them a shepherd, but still uses the language. That's not a good endorsement. Now, I just want to make one little side comment for a minute. If you have any kind of spiritual leadership position anywhere, you should be terrified of Ezekiel 34. A lot of people really think being a spiritual leader in a church is a really cool thing until you become one. and you realize how God looks at you and evaluates you and thinks about you. And by the way, you don't have to be a pastor to do this. Any kind of spiritual authority you have in the lives of anyone, and parents, this would include you, even if you're a small group leader, Ezekiel 34 should terrify you, because what it says is God's paying attention to you. And he wants to know, if I entrust these people to you, will you care for them at the expense of yourself? How much do my people really matter to you? You know, one of the blessings that I have, I love doing this, is when our people who aren't normal Bridgeway speakers get up on stage, one of my job responsibilities is to coach them. And I tell people all the time, do never get up on that stage if you don't love the people you're talking to. I'm not interested in your content. Well, I am. But if you have the best content and the best delivery and have not love, it equals what? Nothing. If you have any kind of spiritual authority over anyone, Ezekiel 34 should bring you up short. To do a self-evaluation yourself. And Jesus does this in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation, the first 3 chapters. Because he says to the angels, which is really the messengers, the leaders of these churches, these 7 churches, he says, this is what I like about you, this is what I don't like about you, and if you don't fix it, I'm removing your lampstand. What he means by that is I'm taking my presence away from you. You might still have a church and take offerings and do all the stuff you normally used to do. I'm not going to be a part of it anymore. That should terrify us too. So, just because this is Ezekiel 34 and we like to beat up on the religious leaders in the New Testament, don't stray too far from it. Pay attention. So Jesus is using this very explosive language in 10, reminding everybody of 34. Now, if you remember at the end of Ezekiel 34, the last 2 verses we looked at, there was a phrase that happened twice, and I told you to hang on to it. How'd you do hanging on? What is it? Lie down. I'm trying to think if there's an Old Testament passage that has the phrase, lie down in it. It's so weird. Is there a passage like that might have like a shepherd motif to it? That might have the phrase lie down in it? What one could it be? What do you think? Psalm 23. Oh yeah, dummy. So when Jesus in John chapter 10 is talking about bad shepherds and good shepherds, he's using language from both of these places to let them know who he is and who they are. And so he uses Psalm 23 as a foundation to say, that's what a good shepherd looks like. So to end, I want to talk about Psalm 23 for a while. Because Psalm 23 is probably one of the most misunderstood and misused chapters in the Bible. So my relationship with Psalm 23 goes back at least a decade, if not more. I knew it before, but I could take you to the spot in the backyard of a pastor's house in South Africa where I was sitting on a rock reading Psalm 23. I was just doing my normal Bible reading that I would do. So I read Psalm 23. Okay, I got it. Psalm 24. And I start reading Psalm 24, and I'm stopped. I'm like, wait a minute. So I go back to Psalm 23. And I read it again. And then I read it again. And the more I read Psalm 23, the more annoyed I became. You can see a theme in my life, don't you? And this was my annoyance with Psalm 23. I read this description in Psalm 23, and my annoyance was this. I don't know anybody who lives like this. I know I don't. And I have another annoying trait. I think if this is how God describes how life's supposed to be, then for me, it should be possible. So how in the world does Psalm 23 exist and nobody looks like it? And especially not me. And so I started doing a deep dive into Psalm 23, trying to figure out this very familiar psalm, what in the world is going on. And all we're going to have time for is looking at verse 1, but trust me, it'll be enough. Because I don't know about you, but growing up in church, when I read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," my interpretation of that was, now that I've become a Christian, God's going to take care of everything I need. That is not what Psalm 23:1 is about at all. So let's break the verse down into some parts. The first part is, "The Lord is my shepherd." Really? Is that true? Is the Lord your shepherd? Now, again, I know we're in church. You're supposed to say yes. I understand. I want to read to you a section from a new book that's coming out on Psalm 23. And it's talking about shepherds. There are other shepherds out there that we follow their promises to do one or all of these things above. Many choose their job as a shepherd. It guides where they live without any thought of whether God thinks that's a good place for them or not. They are trusting in their job to protect and guard them for a secure future. Who knows what God might do one day, but I can trust my 401k. Some have a key relationship as their shepherd. Whatever their mother, father, spouse, boss, lover, best friend, or maybe even their children say, that is what's going to guide them. That relationship is what was going to help them grow. This relationship is what they are trusting in to keep them from harm. They might be a Christian, but the Lord definitely has to take second place in shepherd position to mama. What is guiding my life could be my own desires. My desire for a spouse, my desire for a specific standard of living, my desire for a mark of achievement, my desire to be seen as spiritual, my desire for children, my desire to have what he has or what she has. My shepherd could be my fear of others rejecting me. That fear is what guides my life. If everyone likes me, that will guard me from pain. If everyone likes me, only then can I grow into a happy, healthy person. Does allowing fear to shepherd you ever work out for anyone? Now, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. Okay, maybe the desire to be seen as spiritual is always a bad idea, but besides that one, there is really nothing inherently wrong with any of them. But when they become the shepherds of our lives, we are allowing that thing, that goal, that person to be the guiding, growing, and guarding of our lives. They are about our future and our reputation, and then the Lord is not our shepherd. And Psalm 23 might as well have never been written. The Lord has been replaced with a shepherd of our own choosing, one that we can control, that we can see, that we think is real, and dare I say, better. We don't say it. We don't even think about it. But many times, we are afraid of the Psalm 23 shepherd. He is too unpredictable, too out of control for our liking. So we pick lesser shepherds. Yet when we pick a lesser shepherd, we settle for a lesser life, and all the promises of Psalm 23 vanish like mist in the morning sun. Why is the average Christian life not so Christian? Maybe they've chosen a lesser shepherd, one that can't offer all that Psalm 23 shepherd can offer, but one that might dribble out a little guidance, a little growth, a little protection, enough that we might be able to live with it. Is that the kind of life you want? I don't. Yes, the Psalm 23 shepherd is completely out of our control. Do you really want a shepherd you can control? The truth of the matter is, if the Lord is not your shepherd, then you are ultimately your shepherd. And in the infamous words of Dr. Phil, how's that working for you? I believe that much of the despair, loneliness, and spiritual longing that many Christians have is not because they have not tried hard enough. Many are trying so hard it's killing them. But when has God ever asked us to try harder? Is trying harder the way of a true shepherd? He longs to guide, restore, anoint, and to, well, shepherd us. This question is one of the most important you will ever answer. Who truly is your shepherd? Everything that Psalm 23 offers and paints for us is only possible if the Lord is your shepherd. But we're not done. The Lord is my shepherd. Present tense. Not the Lord was my shepherd. And God, thank you for getting me where I am now. I'll take it from here. See, the good shepherd is the is shepherd. Not the, once I get what I want and get my life straightened out and headed in the direction I want, then you will be my shepherd. It's not a have been, it's not a will be, it's an is right now. The Lord is my shepherd. This moment, this day. See, you need to understand a very powerful spiritual principle. The most powerful, incredible, transforming thing you have is right now. It's the only thing you got. But trust me, it's enough. And if you are still waiting for something in the past to catch up to you, or hoping someday you'll get something so that is better, it'll never happen. The Lord is my shepherd, is he? See, I'm sure it's really easy for you to think, well, he's Pastor Dan's shepherd, of course. He's Pastor David's shepherd, of course. I mean, they've got important things to do. We really don't, but... But me, who am I? I'm a rat in a maze. I'm a cog in a wheel. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, my boss will replace me in a week. What does my life matter? Now, again, we don't say that. But it's much easier to think the Lord is someone else's shepherd than it is to own him as yours. And so that's one of the reasons why we think we can get away with stuff and it doesn't matter. Because he's busy doing other more important things, working with other more important people than me. So I can go over here and do this and no one will know. Or he might know, but he's not going to bother me about it. See, until you understand, Psalm 23:1 is the core door entryway into a Psalm 23 kind of life. And if you don't have verse 1 down, and part of your internal spiritual relational belief with God, then the rest of 23 is a waste. It's a pipe dream that'll never happen. Because the Lord is my shepherd. And until that reality is my relational position with him, the rest of it doesn't matter. You might say, well, Pastor Dan, how is there like one really good litmus test that can tell me whether the Lord is my shepherd? I go, yes, absolutely. Because when the Lord is your shepherd, you do not live your life from an attitude of want. You do not live your life from an attitude of, I don't have enough yet. Now, I'm not saying you don't have enough. That might be true. But we don't live from an attitude of want. So part of it is a cultural problem with the United States because we are bombarded constantly to be discontent. I mean, companies spend millions and billions of dollars to make you discontent, and it works. The problem is it also makes us spiritually discontent too. And so we have a tendency to think about what we don't have instead of what we already got. See, a lot of people have treasures in their life that they don't even know is there. So yes, the new employee at work looks really, really good. But what about the wife you said vows to 20 years before? You too, ladies. And it goes both ways. Because see, the problem is we know what's wrong with them. We don't know the crazy about them yet. And there's one person in between the two of them that we haven't diagnosed the crazy about yet either. Singles, I've always said this, if you don't know someone's crazy, don't marry them yet, because everybody's got one. But we can approach our life from an attitude of discontent, even spiritually. That God's holding back on me. He's not giving me enough. I'm functioning from a mind, they use the term we use in today's culture is that I'm functioning from a mind of scarcity. And that if God loves them, he can't love me. Or if he does something really good for them, the bank account's drained, I get nothing. It's not how God functions. It's not how God works. It's not how a Psalm 23 shepherd works. So, Psalm 23 verse 1 is the entry door requirement to a Psalm 23 kind of life. And until you really decide the Lord is my shepherd on a habitual relational basis, and I don't have this attitude of want that God is holding out on me and holding back on me, and my life will get better if I just get the thing I don't have. Why do you think he's going to give you something you don't have if you don't care for the stuff you got? And that means people, things, relationships, your time, all that other stuff. There's this weird idea in Christianity called stewardship. Stewardship means everything you got, God gave to you as a blessing, and he expects you to take care of it on his behalf. It's not your stuff in the first place. So my wife's not mine, it's a gift. Most of the time. And seriously, me coming up here and speaking on a Sunday is a gift. It really is. I love doing it. I'm always blown away when I'm given the opportunity. And I try to steward it well. And so everything is stewardship for us. If you begin to develop the mindset of a steward, the idea of I shall not want is an automatic response to the shepherd. Now, there's so much more about Psalm 23 I would love to go into, but I have two problems. Number one, I don't have enough time. And number two, I've already done it. So this fantastic new wonderful book that I just read from you. Yeah, it only took 10 years. What I do in this book, and by the way, half of the book is journaling pages. So every chapter is divided down into an individual statement in Psalm 23. I try to go into the background of what that statement means, and then what is the implications for me as a sheep who's trying to follow the Good Shepherd? What does that mean for me? And how does it get activated in my life? And so the whole purpose of the book is to be a spiritual tool. By the way, I don't make any money on it. All the money for the book goes to the Resource Center to support our compassion kids. So it's not even anything for me, except for I get this stupid thing off my plate so I can do something else. But I really hope that the things when I do write things, and this is self-published, so if we run out of them, we'll get more, is to be a tool for you to make your spiritual life Monday through Saturday better. And so my encouragement to you, if you want to dive into Psalm 23, I think it's a really good tool. It's hardback and paperback if you're interested, if you care. If you like hardback, you better get it today because they're almost gone. Jesus in John chapter 10 does something explosive. He implodes his audience with their theology and their history so they know who he is. And makes this clear contrast between the spiritual leaders and what they just did to a man born blind and who Jesus is. And gives the people a choice to make. Now, if you choose him, you might get excommunicated. It might be the best thing that ever happened to you. Because when you follow the good shepherd, yes, he might take you through the deepest, darkest valleys that you'll ever experience. That's what walking through the valley of the shadow of death means. It doesn't mean death. If you look, a lot of translations in the notes at the bottom will tell you it's not about death. This is not a funeral psalm. This is about life. And there are times that the shepherd, because the phrase before that is, we go on the right path. Why do we go on the right path? What's the purpose? Do you remember? Path of righteousness for? His name's sake. Oh, it's not about you again. And then the very next verse is, and if I go through the deepest, darkest valley, guess who took you there? Don't be fooled to think the shepherd's not going to take you through darkness. He will. But he doesn't take you there to leave you there. He takes you there to take you somewhere else. And you might not see him, and you might not hear him. And the reason I know that is because he says in Psalm 23, and I know you are with me. How do I know you are with me? Because I've experienced verses 1, 2, 3 before I get to 4. And now I have an experience. I know my shepherd by experience. He's not going to leave me in the dark. Now, you might not like it. In fact, you might be very afraid. That's why the passage says, fear no evil, because you probably already are. But he says, I'm with you. You might not be able to see me. You might not be able to hear me. I'm taking you somewhere, because that's what a good shepherd does. So the thing you have to really grapple with today is, who is my shepherd? And again, be really, really clear that if you are going to say that the Lord is my shepherd, that you understand what you're saying and what you're committing to. That the Lord is today he cares about what's going on with me today, shepherd who's taking me somewhere. And he's already given me everything I need for today to get through to today. So I don't need to approach today from an attitude of want. I've got everything I need for today. Because I believe the shepherd is taking me somewhere. Pastor, come on up.